Hello everyone, this is Lala and today I'm going to start the first video of the Big Brother Archetypes series where I'm delving specifically into one archetype slash stereotype. And this video is going to be about the nerd slash genius slash dork archetype, and this is about the men. Notice that I didn't put superfan in the title, though you will see a lot of superfans in this group, but it's not a requirement. It'll make sense once I go through the people. So essentially, this archetype represents a group of men who are known for their book smarts and intelligence, which makes them stand out amongst everyone else on their specific casts. They are usually extremely young, early to mid 20s, give or take, and due to not fitting in with the more athletic or conventionally attractive cast members, in addition to being very young, they are seen as very naive, which can work to or against them in the game. They are usually given a quote unquote virgin narrative in addition to this, or a quote unquote inexperienced narrative, and due to being seen as inexperienced in many different ways, they can either go under the radar or can be screwed up by a more powerful hostess, or they're just alienated until they're inevitably booted. The men who fit this archetype are usually white men, and this could be for a few reasons. One, it could be due to more white men not only applying for the show, but watching this show, so more people of this archetype would fit that group. I do remember the producers making some mention about how they had issues with a lot of non-white people applying, or that might have been for Survivor, but same difference, really. So maybe a lot of non-white people don't fit the archetype because not many of them are actively applying because they are superfans or they fit this archetype, if that makes sense. Or maybe it's also because non-white men, on average, are not seen as innocent and dutiful for a lot of reasons, which I could get into, but it's really just not appropriate right now, and I honestly just don't feel like it. As time went on, this archetype started being associated with the quote-unquote male superfan, and I think it's for a few reasons. If you look at the earlier versions of this archetype, there's a vacancy regarding the representation of this archetype in the first era of the show, since superfandom really wasn't a thing like that back in the day. But it became more prominent with the second era for the men, which is in the post-classic era, like Eric, Ronnie, Kevin, Reagan, Ian, that kind of grouping, and then it became more and more prominent with the third and fourth eras, which is the modern era and the diversity era, where it became a lot more commonplace within the last decade, and it's expected at this point. And there have been recent seasons where there's more than one person of this group that are on the same cast. So, the first person I have to talk about is Josh from Big Brother 3, and he's the only person from the classic era to fit this archetype. What's interesting about him is that there really wasn't the concept of a superfan yet at this point in time, since there's only really one real Big Brother season beforehand. So there still wasn't much of a template for him to go off of. But as we all know, Rob Cesternino was initially cast for Big Brother 3, where he was supposed to be the sketchy, smart young guy, but he was pulled last minute, and they replaced him with Josh, who was clearly meant to be in that vein. So while he wasn't cast to be a superfan per se, because that didn't really exist yet, he was clearly supposed to be cast as that sketchy strategist who was so much smarter than everyone and was a dork. And due to this, it got him in that majority alliance since he was kind of aggressive in making that happen. But things just fell apart due to that because he was very awkward with a lot of the house guests. He kept on groping and slapping the women's. But he really wanted to be that alpha guy, but he just wasn't at all. And he didn't have the social grace as someone like Roddy either. He was really kind of just seen as someone who was very creepy, and everyone caught on to his game very quickly, to the point where Marcellus targeted him during the beginning of the week, and he was lucky to make it through that round where he was nominated against Tanya, though it was mainly due to the works of Roddy and Eric, which is why he stayed. After that, he was somewhat attached to that cartel alliance, but it started becoming the Showman's Alliance. So he was kind of an affiliate there, but he also somewhat started becoming an outsider with like the Jerrys, Danielles, Jasons, and the Marcelluses. But they didn't really align with him either, where they kind of just used him as a vote, just in case they needed to target the couples. But he made it a few weeks after that. But once Kiara nominated him in the mid season point of view, all of his bad social graces, all of his bad strategic play, all of his awkward socialization, all of his kind of ickiness came back to bite him in the butt, where he was supposed to be safe that round because they are planning on blindsiding Kiara and Roddy, but all of his baggage kind of just came back to bite him in the butt. I think if there was a few seasons worth of a catalog before this, Josh might have been able to integrate a bit better, but he still has all of the social flaws that the people who would come after him in this archetype had, but he didn't have the innocence that caused or that would cause him to be overlooked and people to give him chance after chance after chance compared to some of the others. So that's kind of his experience, and you can tell they didn't really fully grasp the archetype here, which is why we wouldn't see someone else for several seasons and several years after this. So the next person who fits this category is Eric from Big Brother 8. And what's interesting about him is that he's 5 years and 5 seasons after Josh, so literally half a decade later, and you already see some of the differences already. By 2007, there's a decent amount of history and context when it comes to competitive reality TV, especially with CBS competitive reality TV, which Eric definitely knew about. And I think that knowledge that he had, and him just being a bit dorkier in comparison, is why he was cast to be a part of the America's Players Twist, and that will cause him to be a part of another casting trope that I won't discuss for a while. But with Eric, you could definitely tell he knew his history when it came to the show and other shows that were very similar to it. You definitely could tell that he had some sort of complex about him being the scrawnier, skinnier, smaller guy, especially compared to a lot of the athletic hunks or whatever that were clearly cast to be that, especially when it comes to Nick. And you saw that dynamic between the two of them, where he was definitely jealous of Nick and wanted to be Nick. Obviously, Eric couldn't really play for himself, though he definitely had moments where he definitely went against America's wishes so he could get what he wanted. And he definitely just had this very slimy demeanor and disposition about himself. And another thing that I will notice about or note about people in this archetype is that there is a slight sliminess and entitlement to a lot of the people in this archetype. It's almost it's not incel-like because that's not the term that I want to use. But it's pretty much because they are smaller than most men, they are dorkier and nerdier than most men, which can come off as them being sweeter. It seems like they feel like they can get away with having a lot of the same pathologies that some of the more fitter, more conventionally attractive men have when it comes to their entitlement, how they treat women, and stuff like that. And just foul language in general. But despite that, Eric wasn't going around bragging about how much of a super fan he was. He definitely had a lot of other things in his favor. I think because he didn't just solely fit in this archetype, it definitely made things easier for him, where some people wouldn't consider him to be the super fan that is so obviously associated with this casting trope. And I think it's because it was nowhere near as consistent even after the season where that or this casting trope wasn't really officiated like it would be in future seasons at this point in time in the show's history. Okay, so from the same season is Zach, and I don't have a whole lot to say about him because I, in general, don't have much thoughts on him. Zach definitely was not a super fan, and he's a prime example of people who fit into this casting group without being super fans. And I don't even think he was much of a fan of the show at all. But he definitely fits this because he was definitely a dorky, socially awkward guy compared to everyone else on the cast. It was clear that the social cues were something that he really didn't get. He was interested in what he was interested in, and he didn't really care to get to know the others properly. And he definitely had the qualities that would be associated with the nerd slash genius slash dork, where he was kind of overlooked because he wasn't seen as a threat, though he definitely had his weird ways and antics to him. But he showed up near the end, and yeah, we definitely saw the social flaws here that would be common with people in this archetype, but because it wasn't really solidified, the casting archetype, I mean, he's kind of a looser example of this. We're just gonna move on because it's Zach. I feel like Big Brother 11 is the first season where we had the official nerd and the official superfan archetype really being established here in the more cliche way that is commonly known, but not as frequent, with Ronnie being one of the first from this season. He was very proud to be a nerd, a dork. He definitely he wasn't the youngest. But I also think him being married kind of got rid of some of that social anxiety that a lot of the people or the men in this archetype tends to face. But he definitely gave a lot of that nerd vibes where he was cast to be on the brains team, so obviously someone with high intellect and who partook in the stereotypically nerdy or dorky things would fit in that category. And I definitely think him being a part of the brains kind of just exemplified his stereotype even more. He was also someone that was a huge fan of the show and knew what he was talking about when it came to the history of the show. I honestly think that he was a bit too confident compared to a lot of the super fans, and like I mentioned, him being married meant that he wasn't seen as innocent, and it caused him to be definitely a bit more devious, which obviously came to bite him in the butt, especially with him trying to play both sides and stirring up the pot, while also not being able to handle the smoke very well. So he's very interesting in the fact that he flamed out, really, and he I don't want to say alpha energy because I don't think he was an alpha person at all, but he wasn't the young, naive boy, and he wasn't afraid to be villainous and cutthroat, and there was a lack of innocence with Ronnie that makes him distinct. So, the second person that I think fits this casting archetype is Kevin. Obviously, with the fact that he was cast to be in the Oddballs group, causes him to be in another category, and that was the huge focus. But Kevin was clearly a dorkier, nerdy, but definitely more dorkier person, and he was definitely a huge fan of the show at the time, so he was cast because he was knowledgeable of the game, and he was someone who struggled to fit in school. And with the theme of Big Brother 11, that kind of fit. It was interesting because he and Ronnie did not get along at all. And Kevin fits a few other casting archetype. So I think that's why his experience is so different compared to a lot of the people in this specific tier. Since he isn't a white man, he's also gay, and he also fit another team for this casting twist specifically related to Big Brother 11. But in general, he wasn't a part of the popular group. Even on the side of the house, he didn't bond with the athletes. And I do think that a lot of that baggage kind of carried over into All Stars as well. Or All Stars 2, where we saw him not get along with a lot of the Alpha Bros or the Finnish jocks on that season. He didn't really get along with. I don't think he and Ian had beef, but they weren't really the closest. Though they kind of fit the same archetype for that season as well. Though a lot of his reads were very young, he bonded a lot with Nicole Anderson on that season, despite her limited time on the season. And I know they're good friends now. And I think it's because they're kind of the male and female counterpart for one another when it comes to their casting archetype. So there was that. So we are moving on to the next season in Big Brother 12. We have one person, and that is Matt. So we're starting to see a bit more consistency, not only when it comes to the consecutiveness with the seasons, but the quantity within that specific season. So Matt's definitely here because he's the smartest person in the world, or at least according to him. He was definitely cast because of his brains. He was definitely a super fan from what I remember while he was on the show, and he used his knowledge of the game to his advantage, especially compared to his other allies, who were definitely on the recruit mactor side of things, where they didn't know anything about the show. He definitely fits another category that I'm definitely going to get into, and I think he definitely fits there more than here, since he didn't really have that nerdy disposition, though he definitely had the high intelligence and the fandom knowledge. Though I also think him aligning with all the bros definitely kind of helped him dim some elements of this archetype that he fit in. But we did see him bond very much with Reagan, where that wasn't the case in other seasons where there was more than one of them. And that's kind of the case in the future, too. So they obviously had a rapport, but Matt was loyal to his Brigade alliance. He definitely tried to overplay and underplay at times, where he definitely wanted to appear like the smartest person in the room and that he was masterminding everything, but he underplayed at times because he didn't make the appropriate moves that he needed to make. He didn't have that social awkwardness compared to many of the others in this archetype, but I think more of his story and casting fits into another category that isn't this, so we're just going to move right along. So, the next person, in my opinion, is more so the prototypical superfan nerd that fits this archetype, and that is Reagan. He went on and on to talk about how he knew everything about Big Brother. He knew all about all of the prior seasons, and he definitely exhibited that knowledge throughout the house. And because he knew a lot about the meta elements of the show, he knew that he had to be very under the radar, while a lot of the bigger personalities kind of just took shots at one another. And that definitely worked throughout a lot of the season for him. He would go on to talk about stuff like the Nerd Herd, which Rachel kind of weaponized against him, accusing him of being such. He didn't really get along with the bro types throughout the season, and those relations only got worse as the season went on. He got along with Matt, but like I mentioned, Matt isn't really like that bro fitness person, anyways. And Reagan's definitely someone you can kind of tell got better about his experience overall. So I think some of it had to do with his sexuality, and he felt like he should have been given a lot more props compared to a lot of the other men who fit his archetypes after him. But he definitely didn't get some of the treatment that the latter superfans got, where they're kind of revered in their strategy, their innocence kind of worked in their favor, and they're kind of propped up by CBS and the fanbase, which he never really got, despite him making it to the endgame on Big Brother 12. I also think he definitely benefited from having someone like Emmet there, where they're kind of the same archetype, where they're able to work with one another, which wasn't the case with a lot of the people who fit this archetype on prior seasons and future seasons where there was more than one of them. So Reagan definitely had that to his advantage. But I do think a lot of the other elements of his game and journey on Big Brother had to do with some of the other archetypes that he fit in over this one. Though by the time he came around, he was kind of the prototype or one of the main prototypes that would be consistent from this point onwards. So there weren't any one that fit this archetype on Big Brother 13, though I think that's due to the heavy vet presence, especially on that season. But we move on to Big Brother 14, where I feel like this is where everyone fully realized that this archetype existed, and they've been very consistent from this season onwards. And obviously, I'm referring to Ian, and he's probably the prototype of this archetype, mainly because he's one of the few that actively won, but he's also the only one who came back for another season as well. Ian was very socially awkward to the point where he was building a target amongst himself, which is why Bookie had to save him that first week. Once he got that immunity for the first week, which was really 2 weeks, he was able to somewhat make some inroads, so it seemed like people kind of realized that he was a vote that could have been used, and he did lay under the radar for half of the season, though he is definitely giving information from Buggy and Frank to what would become the Quack Pack, which was really the four of them already being in an alliance, the four being Dan, Danielle, Shane, and Brittany, and he was kind of just the fifth vote. And then once the jury portion took place, he was definitely targeted by Dan throughout the entire rest of the season, as well as Frank as well. But Ian just kept on winning competitions, though he didn't really realize that he was being targeted. He was very oblivious to what was happening, during the second half of the season. But because he had that innocent demeanor, people felt bad for him. And he was someone that could easily be babied. That definitely benefited him, especially when he was at the end with Dan, who was definitely vilified mainly due to his own actions and people wanting a newbie to win instead of a veteran. So it's clear with Ian that despite some of his off behavior and some of his rude commentary, he's definitely the prototype for this, where people were unthreatened by him in the beginning. He was kind of baby due to his appearance, due to him being young, and despite him being a super fan, he didn't have that life experience. And it was clear to me that he came back on Big Brother 22, which was Big Brother All Stars 2, trying to replicate the same strategy where he laid low during the first half of the season. I was hoping to just win out during the second half, but the dynamics of the show have changed since then, since a lot of people get into one huge majority alliance and they stick with it. And the thing with Ian is that he was never a part of that main alliance on Big Brother 22, and the dynamics of the season were so unmovable, so he couldn't replicate the same strategy and he couldn't adapt well either. We definitely saw how inflexible and how really not knowing he was about the game, and he couldn't strike that luck twice, hence him being the first juror on that season. It's clear that he's arguably the most notable and the most successful person of this archetype, and I don't see that really changing anytime soon. So we are moving on to the final season in the post-classic era with Big Brother 15, and the first person that I have from this season is McCrae. He definitely isn't really a nerd. That just isn't his thing. But he's mainly here due to him being a huge super fan, and he got the meta of the game and the show, which he definitely used towards his advantage in the game. When it comes to knowing when to go under the radar, when to throw competitions, how to not appear on camera, how to not do certain things because he knows that the bigger bold moves isn't good for him, and compared to the cast where there's a lot of non-fans, he definitely knew what to do. I wouldn't really say he was that smart, because he just wasn't. There was really nothing hugely intellectual about him, and he just didn't give nerd vibes or nerd attitude at all, and he wasn't portrayed as a nerd. A dork, I could definitely see how he would be portrayed as a dork, especially with him trying to make that whole him being a pizza guy thing. Anyways, most of his content after the first week had him hiding behind Amanda and getting into that showmance. But I do feel like McCrae kind of saw what worked for people. Like Ian picked up on the visible and the non-visible stuff, and almost every single person who fit this archetype after him kind of followed that mantra. So yeah, that's all I have to say about him. So we are going to move on to the winner of the same season in Andy. And what's interesting about him is that despite him being one of the very few who actually won, he honestly isn't the most notable. And I honestly think that's for two reasons. One is that he was literally invisible for like half of the season. And two, it's because his season is like persona non grata for CBS with all the controversy that took place. But Andy is very similar to Reagan in the sense that they were both professors when they did the show. Obviously, they're both gay. They both came in intentionally downplaying themselves, wanting to play a very under the radar game, putting down all the fires that were happening in the house since it would have blown up their spots. But Andy was definitely playing a more active Weasel game, and he was actually in a lot of the dynamics of the season compared to a Rickon who was doing all of that but wasn't in the in group. Andy definitely knew a lot about the show. He was a huge super fan before the show. He's still one now, over a decade later. He knew that he could play innocent whenever he wanted to, and he knew that due to his smaller size, he could kind of weaponize things in his favor, and he could twist things to whatever narrative he deemed fit that benefited him, and he did that very well. I remember him dropping stuff in every room so he could have an excuse to go to those rooms to pick stuff up so he can overhear conversations, and he definitely spun a lot of the narratives about people that caused them to go home. So he definitely played a good game, despite it being kind of icky. But he wasn't the most charismatic at all, to the point where he didn't get much screen time until they absolutely had to show him. But he's a prime example of a superfan winning, though I definitely think he had more to offer than this archetype or the average person of this archetype. Even compared to the ones who did win, I definitely do think his game had more depth to it. But it's still kind of icky, so let's move on. So we are skipping a season and moving on to Big Brother 17, where the first person in this archetype is Jason. And I definitely felt like he was cast to somewhat be similar to an Andy or a Reagan, but I felt like they wanted him to be more sassy and argumentative. And I guess in some ways it definitely worked out for him. But I don't feel like he's as skilled as either of them. I definitely do feel like Jason had potential to be very good, since he's obviously a huge superfan. He was listing seasons that weren't very popular and players that weren't very known in the mid 2010s Big Brother era. So it seemed like he was very knowledgeable, and he did have a group of people working with him. And I felt like if he put in work, he could have had a lot of good relationships with the other side, but he just didn't put in the work. He kind of just sat on the couch in the backyard smoking all the time, and he was just really, really, really passive. And I do know that he didn't get along with Steve, where I feel like Steve is supposed to be the more prototypical nerdy superfan, where Jason was kind of had a huge emphasis on him being the sassy gay superfan. So while he is in the same archetype, there's definitely some nuances and differences that the intersectionality brings. So that's really all I have to say about him, and I definitely think his passivity caused him to be booted earlier than a lot of the others in this group. So, from the exact same season is Steve, and I feel like, or I think he's the final one that actually won the game. Obviously, from the very beginning, people inside the house and outside of the house were comparing him to Ian, and I definitely think that was an intentional choice by the producers and the network to cast someone who is very Ian light, where Steve was definitely a super fan of the show. He knew that he needed to lay low in the beginning. He was kind of on the out of his alliance for the first part of the season, which did benefit him. He did start to win competitions throughout the end game. And he was just as socially awkward as Ian. Honestly, I think he was more socially awkward than Ian. And I really don't have much to say. He was definitely seen as innocent because of him being extremely young, extremely naive, extremely inexperienced, and him being white probably had to help him in that regard too. But he did what he needed to do. He followed the Superfan Blueprint, which has been and was established by this point in time in Big Brother history, and he used it to win the season. And he pretty much dipped out of the public eye ever since, which is definitely respectable, but I don't have a whole lot to say about him. And he really isn't unique in any regard when it comes to his archetype. The only difference is that he is more aware than some of the other in this archetype, where a lot of them were just a lot more unaware of just the dynamics in their specific seasons and houses. So, the next person in this casting group is Cameron from BB19, and clearly there's not going to be much to talk about since he was only in the house for a few hours. Though, with the way the day one boot was set up this season, there was a lot more social element compared to the prior and future ones as well. And just from what we saw of the season, we knew that it wasn't a nerd slash dork slash male superfan friendly cast. So Cameron wouldn't have done well, most likely, had he made it through this. And we can see or predict that based on who is after this. But it's clear that he was cast in the exact same mold as a Steve and an Ian, and it was very intentional and was very carbon copy at this point. So, from the exact same season, Big Brother 19 is Ramses, and he didn't have a good run here. One thing that I definitely did notice about him is that he was very socially awkward in the fact that he didn't bond with many people, and he was in an initial group with the likes of Vagillion and Meg and whatever. But once that fell apart in the first week, he was really kind of just on his own. Paul really shut him out of the gameplay dynamics of the season and really put him in the box. And while people outside of Paul weren't actively gunning for him, it caused Ramses to be pawned out of the house, where Jessica stupidly nominated him as a pawn against Josh and then didn't use the veto, but it caused him to go home. And I think the issue with Ramses is that he was very passive socially and strategically, where he never really did much of anything. He never really took initiative. And you could definitely tell a part of it was due to him being very uncomfortable. And this was relatively a recruit heavy cast, if I'm remembering it correctly, especially with it being cast around Paul. But he's kind of just one of the prime examples of how this casting trope can fail in the game, especially if you don't have the social skills, if you don't have the competitive skills. And it might have been harder for him because he's not a white man, so that innocence that some of the men from this archetype benefits from, he didn't really get that, if that makes sense. Okay, now we are moving on to the next season, and the representation of this archetype for Big Brother 20 is Scotty, and I definitely do think he's a bit unique in this regard. His virginity was definitely something that was discussed about a lot in the house. We definitely had that naive or inexperienced vibe to him, but there's something about his demeanor, something about his attitude, and just the way he carried himself made him very different from all the others, or most of the others. He had some sort of confidence about himself that made him not have that naive vibe to him. He seemed to have gotten closer or was able to speak to people that were different from him in a more relatable way. Though he definitely had his social issues for sure, where he was kind of just weird, but it wasn't the same sort of weirdness. It's almost like I'm trying to think of the word. Not cool. It's not that he had coolness to him, or he had sass isn't the right word, but he had not swagger. He had a bump in his step, that the others just didn't have, and I think he had a grittiness to him that definitely made him stand out. But when it comes to the game, he definitely was the fan or one of the super fans of the game. He was definitely cast to be the nerdy person, but due to that grittiness that he has that the others just didn't, he didn't really fit in, or he didn't fit into the archetype as well as others did. He definitely made the move to split up the bros, but whenever he got involved in things strategically, he did get very messy and he was very untrustworthy to the point where a lot of his allies didn't trust him, and it caused him to be booted in a round where he really shouldn't have been booted. But Scotty definitely added some variation with the archetype, especially compared to the last few before him, where it was almost like they're just clone copies of one another, so I do appreciate him for that. But he's a prime example of someone who's good at the game, and definitely is nerdy, but just couldn't execute anything well in the game, despite him not being an early boot. To me, it was obvious that Ovi was supposed to be the nerdy superfan archetype of Big Brother 21, and I do think just from the fact that he was on Big Brother 21, where there were a lot of non-fans and there were a lot of white people on the season, it made his journey pretty unsuccessful, though I think the super fan part had little to do with it, and there are other elements as well. So I think I remember people accusing Ovi of lying when it came to having a girlfriend. They didn't think he had a girlfriend because of his appearance and him being the nerd. They made fun of him behind his back and they kind of just clowned him, which was very sad and uncomfortable to watch, unfortunately. So he definitely had all that going on, and despite knowing the game, he couldn't execute it well, where it got him on the block in the first week, and then he had that superpower, but he didn't know how to use it, and whenever he told people like the Jacks about it, they just kind of turned it on him, told other people about it, and used it as even more for justification to get rid of him. But he didn't have the innocence that the archetype usually presents, and obviously his non-whiteness definitely did not benefit him in arguably the last season before the diversity era was really, or the diversity quota was really taken into effect. So that is Ovi, and he was the first boot by normal circumstances on the season. So yeah, he's arguably the least successful. So the next person in this group is Derek X from Big Brother 23, and he's a very interesting one because he doesn't really fit it well. But I'm putting here because I think production wanted him to fit this archetype. Because obviously, one, they focused a lot on him being an intellectual, being very smart, and being kind of dorky, though they kind of edited out a lot of his bro-centric content that was prevalent on the feeds, but they didn't put that on the edit, and I think that's because they wanted him to fit this archetype, though it's even odder because he wasn't a super fan at all. Heck, he wasn't even a fan. I think he was recruited to be on the show, and then he did very brief, very minimal research for the show. But like I mentioned earlier, being a super fan isn't a prerequisite to fit this archetype, though it's very common. Obviously, everyone knew how smart Derek was. He was picking up on the game very, very, very quickly for someone who knew absolutely nothing about it. And he definitely had that innocence to him that was given a focus, and I had a lot of the cast feeling sorry for him, so a lot of them kind of took him under their wing. And it caused for a lot of his more devious moves to be kind of overlooked. And he definitely used that towards his advantage. Honestly, this one's probably the biggest stretch out of all the archetypes, but I don't think he fit anything else. So I felt like this is probably the closest that would explain where I would put him when it comes to the casting archetype. But yeah, I definitely do think that the producers and the network intended him to fit this archetype, but it wasn't the strongest in action, and when you put him in the house. So in actuality, it wasn't the strongest, but I do think there's still some elements that are still present. Chronologically, the next person is Daniel from Big Brother 24. I wouldn't really say he's nerdy, but he definitely has the dorkiness to him, especially with him being an Elvis impersonator in his real life and being very socially awkward and kind of unself-aware, despite him thinking that he knew a lot more than he did, especially when it comes to the social interactions of the house. But he realized that he and Michael were kind of a part of the same archetype, and he immediately saw Michael as a threat because of that. So I do think that kind of turned his head where, oh, this person's my archetype, or we are archetypically similar, so I wanted to get them out so I can take up that space. And I think he wanted the opportunities that Michael got in the house, especially during those earlier weeks, for himself, but it just never really worked out like that. Despite him not being really a nerd, and I don't really know how intellectual he was, you can definitely tell that by this point they're starting to kind of, I think for a while now, everyone kind of just saw the super fan and the nerdy dorky person to be the same person. Right? So I do think he kind of, I don't want to say benefits, but he was kind of put into this archetype mainly due to that. Though I do think I'm going to put him in another category, which kind of makes sense. But yeah, you definitely will see throughout these videos that people who share the same archetype tend to target one another because they realize that they are their competition, not only just when it comes to the game, but when it comes to the show as well. And I do think Daniel thought a lot about the meta elements of the show and used that to benefit himself, though it didn't end up really working like that. That's really all I have to say about him, so we're gonna just move on down. From the same season is Michael, and it's clear that he was cast to be the more prototypical, stereotypical, visually known, yeah, the standard nerd slash dork's key superfan archetype. That definitely fits him. One, obviously, he was a superfan. He knew a lot about the show and the history of it, and he definitely made it known throughout the house, though there are elements of him trying to cover it up. And just from looking at him, you can definitely tell he had the glasses, he was very lanky, and he definitely looked different than a lot of the men of the cast, especially because a lot of the cast weren't fans of the show, so he stood out even more. I definitely do think that he benefited from being a non-muscular guy, despite him winning a lot of the competitions in the season. But despite that, people really couldn't overlook his appearance, him being a very intellectual guy. I believe he was a lawyer. He is a lawyer. So he had that going for him. And he was one of the few fans of the show. So a lot of his gameplay and a lot of his deceptiveness was overlooked. I also do think that him being a white, lanky, nerdy guy definitely benefited him, and I do think he weaponized that at several points in the game, especially with that whole comment that I'm really not going to get into. But yeah, Michael definitely had a more deceitful, vengeful side of him, but people always just overlooked whenever his name is thrown around when it comes to doing some of these antics. People always just overlooked it because he's, oh, the golly sweet Michael. So, like I mentioned earlier, the people in this archetype benefit from having their naivete kind of used to shield them, and especially if they are a white nerd, it definitely shields them even more. But eventually, his comp beast reputation and antics eventually bit him in the butt. So in that way, he's definitely different from the superfan or the average superfan, where he wasn't hiding his competition prowess in the first half like many people have done before him. So that's kind of my overall commentary on Michael. So the next season after this is Big Brother 25, and the representation of this archetype is clearly Corey. He was very young when he did the season. I think he was only like 21 and 22, where many of the men who are a part of this archetype are extremely young, which definitely played into the naivete elements that definitely benefited his game. And I feel like Corey, out of all people, most definitely weaponized and used that to his advantage, where despite him being so young and being seemingly so impressionable, he was doing so much gaming, especially during the first half of his game. He was in several different alliances. He spoke up for himself. He didn't allow himself to get railroaded, which we saw during that fight with Jared. And he was playing more aggressively compared to many of the others in his archetype, especially during the first half of his season. But obviously, when the flip happened, he took a back seat and he was extremely passive. Obviously, he fell in love with America, and that was a part of it. But he also got way too comfortable, and that tends to be something that's common with a lot of the men in this archetype, where they feel comfortable in the position that they're in, and due to their false sense of security and comfortability, their read starts to get worse and worse, and they really start to become out of the loop. So that naivete element of them and their personalities definitely shows up here, and we definitely saw that happen with Corey, where he became an early juror. Obviously, he was a huge super fan of the show. He knew a lot about the game, the show, and Survivor. And I'm mentioning Survivor because obviously Suri was on the cast, and he definitely had more information at his disposal when it comes to the meta elements of the show compared to a lot of the others on the cast, which he definitely used to his advantage. But obviously, he's very prototypical compared to a lot of the men on this list. We are concluding this with the latest season with Big Brother 26, and we have three people to talk about here. Obviously, chronologically based on their boots order, the first person that I am discussing is Joseph. Obviously, he was definitely a huge fan of the show, and he seemingly was very smart, though it was bordering on to know-it-all territory where he thought he knew it all, and maybe he's very smart in his real life. I don't really know his credentials or whatever, but it gave him a sense of overconfidence and a false sense of security that he really didn't earn or really have in the house. He definitely did not have the benefit of being seen as youthful, naive, or inexperienced, because I believe he was older than the average person in this archetype, so that didn't work out against him. And while he was awkward socially, it wasn't in an endearing way where people are going to pinch his cheeks and take him under their wing. It was kind of in a way that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And due to a conglomeration of all of that, it caused Joseph to be booted in the late pre-jury mid-season. He didn't really get much of an edit. I don't think he was trying to throw competitions and then went out in the end. He just really wasn't good at the competitions. And that's really all I care to say about Joseph. So we're going to just move on. The next person, the second to last person that I have on this list is Quinn. Obviously, he's a huge super fan of the show. He was listing Jace Wyrie of all people, and even most super fans that are cast on this show within the last 2 hours don't know who that is. So it shows that he really knows a lot about Big Brother. I do think that he told people that he knew a decent amount about Big Brother, and he made it clear how smart he was when it comes to a lot of things. So people kind of just saw his card, or they saw it through him when it comes to that. I don't know much about his education, but it's clear just from his look and how he carried himself and the dynamics with the others, he was definitely cast to be the main uber nerd. Though, when you look at his personality and some of his behavior, it definitely showed that he has a sense of confidence that a lot of people in this archetype didn't have, and he was a lot more comfortable socially with other people. And I think that's what made him stand out a lot, is that he was very socially affable and good. He was very good socially. A lot of the house guests liked him. He never had that awkwardness that most people in this archetype generally have. The issue with him is that when it comes to executing his gameplay and being strategic, he really was not good at it whatsoever. And he's a prime example of just because you are a fan of the show doesn't mean that you're going to be a good player. He definitely had people giving him second, third, fourth chances, and they didn't see him as weird or creepy compared to a Joseph. I'm wondering if that might have to do with racial lines, where Joseph isn't white, he's a mestizo, where Quinn is white. And I've discussed throughout this video that a lot of the white nerdy superfans, they always get coddled and their bullcrap got overlooked. And I think that happened with Quinn for a while, but everything kind of just caught up to him. And he was kind of just a boy who cried wolf as well. But I also think the main difference is that he was actually very good socially, which wasn't the case with Joseph. And when you have more social ties and you execute that better, it causes people to overlook your BS. And that's essentially what happened with Quinn for a while. And the final person in this casting group or trope or stereotype or archetype, whatever word that you want to use, is Chemo. I don't really think he was much of a nerd, but I do think that he fits the dork elements, where he's very dorky, he was very quirky, he can be kind of odd at times with some of his interests and how he carried himself. And he mentioned that he was a fan of the show and he watched a lot of seasons, but just from what I remembered watching him on the feeds and on the show, it seemed like he was more of a casual fan than a super fan. But it's clear that he was supposed to be fitting in this vein, though maybe not as much as a Joseph or a Quinn, but he's more of a dorky, casual fan of the show. But obviously when he got in there, he didn't know what the F he was doing. He didn't really do much of anything. He kind of needed to be led by T. Core when it came to the strategic element of the game, and then after they made the move with Cedric, they kind of just fell back. He kind of lent on Tucker a lot when it came to the strategic element of the game, which was horrible. And then after Tucker went, he literally just did nothing for the second half of the season. It did seem like a lot of the house guests liked him, and he did sing a lot, so maybe that helped him socially when it came to some of the others. But honestly, I just don't want to talk about Chemo anymore, so we're kind of just end it right here. Alrighty, and that concludes everyone that I wanted to cover for this specific casting, archetype, and video. Honestly, I was not expecting this video to be this long, since I believe this is one of the casting archetypes where this a lesser amount of people compared to the others, so it's going to be interesting to see how much longer these feature videos end up being, or if I'm going to split them up into quadrants or whatever. Anyways, the nerd slash dork slash superfanish male archetype, very straightforward. There was some interesting development in the beginning, but they've mainly been carbon copy, carbon copy, carbon copy, especially going from like mid era 2, which is the post-classic era, onwards, and they've put more of them in one season as well. So that's really it. I don't really have much else to say. I feel like this is one of the more obvious casting archetypes, and I'm going to cover their female archetype in some ways. There are some differences between them and the BB male nerds, but it's going to be interesting covering them. That will be the next video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more soon. Take care.